Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with the English actor Richard Griffiths, who died recently at the age of 65, and he's been called the supersized man with supersized talent. The best equivalent I could think to him in the United States is Jackie Gleason in the later stages of his career when he was less a comedian and more of an actor. Richard Griffiths was a large man, he moved gracefully, and he could do both comedy and drama. He's quite familiar on stage and screen to English audiences, and yet despite this, he's not well known here in the United States except for one role, and that role was as Harry Potter's mean uncle in the Harry Potter series.
Isn't it, Vernon?
I'm warning you. If you can't control that bloody bird, it'll have to go.
But she's bored. If I could only let her out for an hour or two.
Well, so you can send secret messages to your freaky little friends? No, sir.
But I haven't had any messages from any of my friends. Not one. All summer.
Who'd want to be friends with you?
I should think you'd be a little more grateful. We've raised you since you were a baby, given you the food off our table, even let you have Dudley's second bedroom, purely out of the goodness of our hearts.
That was Richard Griffiths as Uncle Vernon, and Daniel Radcliffe has said he owes a lot to Griffiths as a mentor. Here's British TV on the death of Richard Griffiths. It begins with Sir Nicholas Hytner, director of the National Theatre in Great Britain.
Like everybody who knew Richard, I'm really shocked and devastated because this came completely out of the blue, and he was one of the most loved actors in our profession, a truly remarkable character and a great actor. And it's really devastating to know that we won't be seeing him anymore on the stage or hearing his amazing stories. He was a quite fabulous storyteller and a great character.
Tremendously versatile, managed to sprinkle his career with many appearances in well-known films, spanning many years, but also stayed true to the stage as well.
Yes, indeed. He was a wonderful stage actor, a great classical actor. I first saw him in the late 70s and early 80s, when he was a very distinguished member of the Royal Shakespeare Company. He was never either off stage or on a film set. He was phenomenally versatile. He had a really remarkable delicacy, which kind of belied his large bulk as an actor, and the combination of the two was really quite unique, and a tremendous wit allied with an ability to convey desolation, sadness, emptiness, which really made him, I think, one of the great actors.
Born to deaf parents, learned sign language very young and had that ability to communicate in different ways. Very good, for instance, accents.
He often talked about his deaf parents, and if you watched him physically, if you watched the extraordinary grace of his gestures, if you watched how he could convey something very simply physically, you maybe saw something of how he was obliged to be as the son of deaf parents. He talked very movingly about that. He was a really complete actor, of great physical charm and delicacy. It was the fact that this large man could move almost like a dancer that was one of his most characteristic achievements.
Did you catch that part about him being the child of deaf parents? What's really fascinating is Lon Chaney, maybe the greatest actor ever, was also the child of deaf parents. Nobody's brought that up, but that's an interesting commentary on acting. Richard Griffiths played in a lot of different movies where you didn't notice him that much. Everything from The Naked Gun 2.5 to Gandhi. He played on Broadway with Danny DeVito. His most famous role was probably in an English play called The History Boys, which was written by Alan Bennett, one of the people from Beyond the Fringe. He was the other guy with Peter Cook doing that comedy interview in The Great Train Robbery in our Great Train Robbery podcast on Bruce Reynolds a couple of weeks back. Alan Bennett became a great British playwright. More from Sir Nicholas Hytner on Richard Griffiths' versatility.
I'll remember him both as an actor and as a colleague. As an actor, he was really quite extraordinary. A very great actor who was remarkably versatile. I first saw him in the late 70s as a distinguished member of the Royal Shakespeare Company. He was a wonderful classical actor with a great intellectual and verbal agility. But he was also a great comic actor. His performance in With Nell and I was one of those performances very few actors get to give, which really seizes the popular imagination. And he gave another performance like that in The History Boys, which I think he would have agreed was his crowning achievement, because The play and the film gave him an opportunity to be funny, delicate, very, very clever, but also to open up great oceans of desolation. He was very, very good, very simply and very truthfully, revealing what you might call life's essential sadness. Very few actors were able to be simultaneously very funny and very desolate, and Richard was able to do that.
Richard Griffiths was also a very funny guy, and as he got older, he mused a lot about age. My favorite Richard Griffiths quote is this one. He said, "Everybody my age should be issued with a 2-pound fresh salmon. If you see someone young, beautiful, and happy, you should slap them as hard as you can with it. When they ask, why did you do that? You say, because you lucky young bastard, you don't know how fortunate you are." And they don't. That was Richard Griffiths. We're going to move on now to a couple of sports figures. We're going to start out with Tom Boerwinkle. And Tom Boerwinkle was one of my favorite basketball players. He died recently at the age of 67, and he was part of the great Chicago Bulls teams of the early 70s. Now, when I say the great Chicago Bulls teams, they never won anything because they were never quite as good as the Lakers and Milwaukee Bucks of those eras, and a little later the Portland Trail Blazers and the Boston Celtics. But Tom Boerwinkle was a great center for the Bulls in the days when they had Norm Van Leer, Jerry Sloan, Bob Love, and Chet Walker.
Start of the second quarter now. Boerwinkle and Clyde Lee jumping. Pass now to a high post. Boerwinkle fakes to Love going by. Boerwinkle turns, dribbles, shoots a jumper over a much smaller Mullins and scores. Comes off long at the rim. Baseline, save, try, good by Boerwinkle. Lee's layup is blocked by Boerwinkle. No good. Rebound kept alive by Portman. Boerwinkle goes after it, flies over the Warrior bench.
Tom Boerwinkle once got 37 rebounds in a game, which is close to the record. The record is 55, but it's the most rebounds anybody's gotten in 40 years. And every night he had to play against the greatest centers in basketball. He had to play against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Nate Thurmond, Dave Cowens, Bill Walton. And every night he came to play as hard as he could. He was, in fact, in my opinion, the best passing center of all time. The only center I can say that could rival him as a pure passer was Bill Walton. As I said, his teams were eliminated a couple of times in the playoffs by the Lakers and by the Milwaukee Bucks. And it's too bad people didn't get to see him on the national stage in the NBA championships, because he was quite a player and quite a worker as a player. And he happened to be a nice guy. I met him a couple of times. So we say goodbye to Tom Boerwinkle. Our next sports figure today is Bob Turley, Bullet Bob Turley, one of the great pitchers for the New York Yankees in the 1950s. In fact, the best pitcher in baseball in 1958. He died recently at the age of 82. Bob Turley came out of Southern Illinois. He was born in Troy, Illinois, and moved to East St. Louis, and he became the property of the ill-fated St. Louis Browns in 1951.
I'm just happy to be up here. It's like being in my hometown where I was raised in Troy, Illinois. I was raised there. I was born there. Raised in East St. Louis, Illinois.
When he came up, he had as good a fastball as there was in baseball. That's why they called him Bullet Bob Turley. And he was quickly made the property of the Browns. And then after a stint in the war, he became the property of the Baltimore Orioles when the Browns moved to Baltimore. A couple of weeks ago when we did Virgil Trucks, we played a little song by Skip Batten, who used to be with the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers, about the St. Louis Browns. And actually, Bob Turley got a mention in that song, too. Ironically, they were teammates for 1 year on the '58 Yankees.
They had a no-hit pitcher. They pitched a real humdinger. But Bob Turley got too surly, and they traded him too early. I got the St. Louis Browns.
When the Browns moved to Baltimore, Bob Turley actually pitched on opening day and won their first game for them. And here he tells none other than Walter Cronkite about it.
Well, the event was that it was the first Major League Baseball game in Baltimore in over 50 years.
The first Big League Baseball came back to Baltimore at that time. And Bob, what part did you play in that game?
Well, I was the winning pitcher. I pitched the first game in Baltimore in over 50 years.
And won it?
Yes.
And won $100 playing News to Me with us tonight, Bob. How does it feel being in Baltimore instead of back in St. Louis where the Browns were moved out to go to Baltimore?
Well, Walter, it feels real good there on account of the Baltimore fans are real good to the ball players, and everything is wonderful there. St. Louis wasn't drawing too good, but in Baltimore the enthusiasm is really good, and it is something to see.
Hey, you got some Baltimoreans out there.
But Bob Turley didn't stay in Baltimore too long because the Yankees were raiding talent in those days from the weaker teams. The Orioles were a weak team coming from St. Louis, and the Yankees saw their chance to pick up a fireballing right-hander. So they made a 17-player trade that included Don Larson, so they got the perfect game out of that too. and he was one of their mainstays 1956, 1957, 1958. He was the Cy Young Award winner in 1958, and he helped win the World Series. Casey Stengel pulled him early in Game 2 after only 5 batters, and I don't think he was happy about that, but he came on to play an integral role in Games 5, 6, and 7 to beat the Milwaukee Braves after the Braves had beaten the Yankees the year before.
And of course, when you play and you win the World Series, that's it. There's nothing, no other place to go. So, and you win the World Series. It's wonderful. You know, I'll tell you about the World Series. I started the second game of the World Series. My record that year was 21-7. In the second inning, they took me out. First inning, they took me. Second inning, took me out of the game. I was never so mad in my life, and we lost that game. And I wanted to get back in the game just as quick as I could. And the earliest I could get in was the 5th game of the World Series, where I beat them in New York. And that was we were down 3-1, and now it was 3-2. Now we go to Milwaukee the next day, and I pitch and relieve Ryan Duran in the 10th inning, and we won the ball game. Then the next day, I came in and relieved Don Larson in the 3rd inning and pitched 6 2/3 innings. Struck out 10 guys in that period of time, and we won the ball game.
Those were in the days when your star pitcher came in relief in the World Series. Struck out Joe Torre's brother Frank to win that Game 6.
And so now you got to have a lot of people in the bullpen. Pitchers pitch 6 and 7 innings, and they get a good game. But they don't, you know, sometimes they don't get a win. They're paid in different ways. We used to get paid on how many games you won. Today they just pitch 5 or 6 innings and do a good job. That's in their record. They got a different way of rating pitchers today.
As I said, he won the Cy Young Award in 1958, and that was when there was only one winner in both leagues.
When I won it, there was only one winner. Today there are 2 winners, one for the American National League. A lot of people get confused, say, well, you were the Cy Young of the American League. And I said, no, American and National League.
Turley also won the Hickok Award that year as the Professional Athlete of the Year in 1958. His career tailed off after that. He played into the early 60s, and then he became a successful businessman in Atlanta, Georgia. We're going to move on now to Dennis Lussier, a.k.a. Deke Richards, who died recently at the age of 69, and Deke Richards was a Motown songwriter. He was a white boy who Berry Gordy picked up from Los Angeles, who was a guitar player, and he turned him into a songwriter. The Motown songwriters of the early 60s were primarily Smokey Robinson, Norman Whitfield, and the team of Holland, Dozier, and Holland. But in the early 1970s, Motown picked up their last huge group from Gary, Indiana, supposedly discovered by Diana Ross, and Berry Gordy put Deke Richards together with 2 other songwriters, and he joined them for a little while. They were called the Corporation, and they wrote for the Jackson 5. And this was when Michael Jackson was recording a new kind of music. It was a great sound, and Deke Richards was primarily responsible for their first hits and, in my opinion, their best music. This is a live version of I Want You Back from 1971, and you forget what a fresh sound it was and how good Michael Jackson sounded at the time.
Oh, baby, give me one more chance. Won't you please let me back to your heart? Oh, darling, I was blind to let you go. Let you go, baby. Now since I see you in his arms, do now. Ooh, baby.
Deke Richards was also responsible for 2 of their big follow-up songs. One of them here is ABC. And another great follow-up song, Stop the Love You Save May Be Your Own. By the way, in that song, I want you to notice how clever those lyrics are, too. Isaac said he kissed you beneath the apple tree. That would be Isaac Newton. When Benji felt your hand, he felt electricity. That would be Benjamin Franklin. When Alexander called you, you said you rang your chimes. Alexander Graham Bell. And Christopher discovered you're way ahead of your time. Christopher Columbus. Very clever little lyrics. You know, the sophisticates today criticize that music for being the black bubble gum of the early 70s, but you listen to it and you realize two things. It's over 40 years and the music still stands up, and you also realize what a tremendous talent Michael Jackson was, especially early in his career. Motown was about to move to Los Angeles. The Jackson 5 again was their last really big Detroit group. Did Diana Ross discover the Jackson 5? Well, that's the story they put out at the time. It's probably not true. And the corporation and Deke Richards were put together only after Holland Dozier Holland left Motown and the suits and countersuits started flying. But you got to hand to Berry Gordy. He could still pick songwriters and he could still match them to songs. And the marriage of Jackson 5 and Deke Richards was a great example of that. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And we're going to close tonight with a mention of Phil Ramone, who died recently at the age of 79. Phil Ramone was one of the top arranger-producers of music in the second half of the 20th century. And trust me, Phil Ramone worked with just about everybody. I mean, you name it, he worked with them. Quincy Jones, Ray Charles, Tony Bennett, Etta James, Paul McCartney, Frank Sinatra, Bruce Springsteen, Luciano Pavarotti. He did all kinds of music, and he preferred to remain in the background.
I think one has to say, you try to not put your stamp on the work you do. And I say that not to be humble, but to be honest about it. Productions I think I work on are to be so looked and heard as the moment in time that performance is taking place.
Some of his most notable work was with Barbra Streisand, and Billy Joel particularly called him one of his greatest collaborators. He was an innovator. One of his greatest contributions was persuading Frank Sinatra to re-record some of his great standards. Frank Sinatra was originally against that. And Phil Ramone went to him and said, look, Olivier did Shakespeare in his 20s and then he redid it again in his 60s. You want my children and you want your grandchildren to hear a different interpretation of them, and that persuaded Sinatra to do it. He was important in digitizing records. He was a co-founder of A&R. And while he was there, he worked on compact disc technology and surround sound. He also had a political contribution. He was the sound engineer on Happy Birthday, Mr. President, Marilyn Monroe's presentation for John Kennedy in 1962, which we talked about when we discussed Leroy Neiman.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
He won 14 Grammys. I gotta tell you, it's very hard to pick out his best stuff, and I couldn't play all his best stuff. I don't know. I mean, look at all the stuff he engineered. Evergreen for Barbra Streisand, Bono and Frank Sinatra singing I Got You Under My Skin, Dusty Springfield with The Look of Love, Billy Joel, I Love You Just the Way You Are, Leslie Gore, It's My Party, The Girl from Ipanema by Stan Getz and Astrid Gilberto, Duke Ellington's TV special, John Coltrane's music, a lot of movie music. But if I had to pick one thing, and the thing we're going to close with tonight, it was the 1975 Album of the Year by Paul Simon. In my opinion, it's the best thing that Paul Simon did in the 1970s. My favorite Paul Simon song from the 1970s was the title. He won a Grammy, as did the arranger, Phil Ramone, for Still Crazy After All These Years.
I fear I'll do some damage one fine day, but I would not be convicted by jury of my peers. Still crazy after all these years. Still crazy